Welcome to Nifty 50 Photographers. Today I'm going to talk about how to correctly expose a photograph. There are a few things we can control on the camera to help with this, and I'm going to talk about two of the most critical: aperture and shutter speed. I'm Richard Gill, and I'm a professional photographer specialising in architecture, property and commercial photography and video for businesses. I provide free photography training for beginners, especially if you're a bit older like me, those of us with a bit of grey on our hair or not much hair left at all. I post weekly videos every Friday showing you how to better understand your camera, how to compose and edit your photos so that the image you had in your head when you took the photo matches what you see when you press that shutter. If that sounds like you, then hit the subscribe button and join our community. Remember to click that bell so you get notified when I release a new video. If you stay to the end, I've got a great tip on how to avoid camera shake. Okay, let's get started. First of all, we need to understand how we see things when we're thinking of taking a photograph. We've usually seen a scene we like, we've got a picture in our heads, and we've got to understand a little bit about how the human eye works and what the similarities are with a camera. So let's explore this in more detail. First, my slightly dodgy sketch of the construction of the human eye. As you can see, I'm oversimplifying this, but it's just to give you an understanding so that you can see some parallels with how a camera works. So you have your cornea, an iris, which is going to determine the size of your pupil, a lens, and that data is taken from the back of your eye down the optic nerve. So when you first see an object, the light passes through the lens, it goes onto your retina where it's transferred via the optic nerve at the back of your eye to your brain, which does some processing. Depending how bright it is that day, how much sunshine, how much light there is, your iris will expand or contract to let just the right amount of light fall onto your optic nerve. On a bright sunny day, your pupils are small. Conversely, if you're in a dark room, they'll become very large, letting in more light. The marvellous thing about the eye is it does this continuously. So as you look around the room, from the bright window, your eye or your pupil will close down. And then as you look into the darker corners, it'll open up again to let more light in. So you have this dynamic process of your pupil adjusting its size so the right amount of light is always available. So that means you see everything perfectly exposed. Okay, there might be a couple of exceptions. On a bright sunny day, we have to reach for our sunglasses. But on a dark day, then we might need some additional light, like a torch. So let's compare that with dodgy sketch number 2, how a digital camera works. This is a very basic drawing of that. Again, I've oversimplified it just so you can see the key parts. So we have some similarities with the eye in that we have a lens, we have an aperture, which is like your pupil, but we also have now a shutter, and then the sensor at the back, which would be similar to your optic nerve or retina. So let's look at the way light passes through your camera to hit that sensor at the back. Firstly, it is focused by the lens to pass through the aperture, and then it's going to hit the shutter. Now, so that we get the correct amount of light hitting that sensor system, then the shutter is going to open for a fixed period of time to let the right amount of light through. And then it'll hit the sensor, and the software in the camera, like our brain, will process that into an image. Let's think about aperture first. Aperture will be F numbers in the display on your camera, or stops, and I'll explain stops in a minute. So the slightly confusing thing is that the larger the F number, the smaller the aperture. That's a smaller hole. So the bigger the number, the smaller the aperture. Conversely, if you have a small number, then you have a large aperture. And the range will vary depending on the lens you've got on and the camera type and so on. It might go as low down as f1.4, that's usually on little prime lenses, but it'll go right up to f22, even up to f32. As I say, it's going to depend on the lens and the camera. And the more expensive they are, generally they will go down. Those small numbers like f1.4 only appear on the more expensive lenses. You can see a typical range of f numbers or stops here. So what is a stop? A stop is a doubling or halving of the amount of light that you let in when you're taking your photo. So let's think about how the eye behaves and compare that to the aperture in a camera. So what the eye is doing is it continually adjusting the size of your pupil according to the particular scene it's looking at as you turn your head around. Now you don't have that luxury in a camera. You have to set one aperture, and you're going to have to set an aperture that is the average for the whole scene you are photographing. That's how cameras work, and that's how you normally set your aperture, unless you're trying to create some very special creative effect. So you'll have to choose an f number that averages out all the different scenes. So you won't set it for the brightest area and you won't set it for the darkest, but you try and average it out so that you get a correctly exposed photograph across most of the image. Now, there's one other very important issue about choosing that aperture or f number, and that's a thing called depth of field or depth of focus. That sounds more complicated than it is. What it actually is how much of your image is going to look nice and sharp and in focus. So everything from the foreground to the background. The higher the f number, so that's the small apertures, the more depth of focus you will get. So very large apertures, small f numbers, give you very shallow depths of focus. And in my next video, I'll show you how you can put that into practice to completely change the look of a photo. Let me explain that depth of focus in a little more detail, just so you can get your heads around it. So imagine you're trying to take a picture of your child or one of your children, your grandchildren, somebody like that. You see my sketch here, another of my famous dodgy sketches. We've got our subject here, the child, and then we've got some items in the foreground, some flowers, a cat or a dog or something, and then behind our subject there's also some woods and trees, and in the far distance is our hills and mountains. Now, if we wanted to get the whole scene in focus from those things in the foreground right to those things in the background, we would choose a very small aperture, a high f number. Conversely, if we just wanted our subject, so that's just the child, to be the main thing in focus, and we weren't concerned about those other issues in the foreground and background, then we'd choose a very large aperture, and that would give us this very narrow depth of focus just around our subject, and it would completely change the look of the photo because everything else would be blurred apart from the subject. Conversely, if we'd chosen that very small aperture, then everything would be in focus. So it's partly a creative decision. What do I want my photo to look like? Then I can decide what my aperture should be, and is that going to work under the lighting conditions that I'm in. Okay, so now it's time to look at shutter speed. So we've already determined the amount of light is controlled by the size of our aperture. Big holes letting in more light, small holes not letting in so much. However, now the light has passed through that aperture, it's going to meet the shutter. And the amount of light that's going to be let forward is going to be determined by how long that shutter is opened. And as you might imagine, that's measured in time. So it could be several seconds, even minutes for some photographs of like stars. But it could be also something extremely short, especially if you're trying to capture a fast-moving subject. So it might be thousandths of a second. Here's a typical range of shutter speeds. You'll see there's one right on the end, usually called bulb mode, and that's actually where you decide how long the shutter should be open. So you can literally press the shutter once to open it, press it again when you want it to close. And again, we think about shutter speed in terms of stops. So changing from a stop, if you remember, is going to double or halve the amount of light. So if I change my shutter speed from a 30th to a 60th, what am I going to get? Yeah, that's right, half the amount of light, because my shutter is open for half the amount of time. So what shutter speed should I choose? Well, first question to ask yourself is, what is my subject doing? Is it stationary or is it moving? So provided your subject is stationary, then you can choose a very wide range of shutter speed. But there's one important thing you need to bear in mind, and that is, can I hold my camera steady enough while my shutter is open? Because as you imagine, any movement in the camera while you're taking that photo is going to make the image blurry, because it's going to move about on the back of your sensor rather than be fixed in one place. So that's the one key thing you must think about when setting that shutter speed. And as a rule of thumb, it's usually around a 60th. If you want the exact rule, then the shutter speed should be at least the reciprocal of the focal length of your lens. Now that sounds very complicated, but it's actually quite easy, because you'll know the focal length of your lens, it's printed on it, or it'll tell you perhaps on the display on the back of your camera if you've got a zoom lens and you're changing from one focal length to another. So in the case, for example, in this case, I've got a 55mm lens on here. So I know that if I set a shutter speed that is 1/55th or faster, I shouldn't have any problem with camera shake. The nearest shutter speed to that is a 60th. So provided I use a 60th, then I've got nothing to worry about. So that's how it works. So here are some examples of shutter speeds you might want to choose. So if you're holding your camera in your hand and you're just photographing a stationary object, then a 60th is a good starting point. If you've got moving people walking, perhaps you're doing some street photography, then go for a 2/50th. If you're photographing some sports, some of the slower moving sports, then start with something like a 500th. That'll work for football, maybe skiers doing some slow movements and so on. If you're going on to faster moving sports, then you want to increase your shutter speed to 1,000th. And that'll get people running, cyclists and so on. If you're then going into faster things like motorsports, then you're probably going to have to go to a 2,000th to freeze the motion. Same for things like wildlife. If you've got wildlife running, if you're trying to freeze the wing motion of birds, then you want that kind of speed. And then finally, for very fast things like really fast moving animals, motorsport like Formula 1 racing or something, then you probably want a 4,000th of a second. So as I mentioned, when you're thinking about shutter speed, you're also thinking about the creative look of your photo and what you want to show your viewer. So it might even be in a landscape. You want to show that dreamy waterfall where the water has that sort of lovely, soft, sort of white flowing effect. And if you want to do that, then you want quite a long shutter speed so that water's travelled through the image as the shutter is open. Similarly with a moving person, if they're moving, running, you might want to show that blur effect to give the impression of movement, to give some dynamic feel to your photograph. So then you need to choose slightly slower shutter speeds than you would for freezing the action. So a person walking, you'd want a 60th or slower. A moving car, something like a 1/125th or maybe slower again. It's going to depend on the particular speed of the vehicle. If you want to do light trails, so those are those photographs like this with those long red and coloured lines, and that's created by the lights of the car travelling through the photo as the shutter is opened. And there you want to go for several seconds, start with 10 seconds and play around with it from there. For waterfalls, as I mentioned, then I would start around a second and build up from there. Okay, so we've now talked about both aperture and shutter speed, but we need to talk about the relationship between the two because they're directly connected to one another. Now, when manufacturers develop a camera, they have a very well-defined amount of light that they know gives the perfectly exposed photo, and that's what they've set everything up to, and that's how their software is optimized. So you need to think of that amount of light as almost as a volume, a fixed volume. I find it helpful to picture something like a ping pong ball as a specific volume of light. We choose an aperture, so that's that whole size, maybe based on our creative desire, what we've got imagined for our photo. And let's say we choose a very large aperture because we want, for example, not very much in focus, a very tight depth of field. Maybe we're doing some artistic portrait. In which case, because we've got that big aperture, our shutter speed will be very fast, will be a faster period of time to let just that ping pong ball's worth of light through to the sensor. So on the other hand, maybe we want a very big depth of focus, in which case we've chosen a very small aperture, so our shutter will be open for a much longer period of time to let that same amount of, that same volume of light hit the sensor. I hope that makes sense. You can see a bit more in this next sketch. And like many things in photography, there's a reciprocal relationship between shutter speed and aperture. So you get the same amount of light if you change the shutter speed and the aperture settings at equivalent amounts. So as an example, if I have a shutter speed of a 30th at f5.6, that is exactly the same amount of light as the shutter speed of an 1/8 at f11. You can try it for yourself on your camera. Essentially, using a faster shutter speed with a wide aperture will provide the same amount of light to the image sensor as when using a slow shutter speed with a narrow aperture. Just remember that original definition of what a stop is. So a stop is a doubling or halving of the amount of light when taking in a photo. So if we increase the shutter speed by 1 stop, then we need to decrease the aperture by 1 stop to have the same amount of light. Now don't worry if that's making your head hurt. Let's do some test photos and look at the settings, and then it should start to fall into place. So find yourself a nice scene, and what you want to do this kind of test is a scene that has a foreground, a middle ground and a background, because you want to see what effect is happening to each parts of those scenes. Now go out and set your camera to aperture priority for starters. Now if you don't know how to do that, you need to watch my previous video on getting to know your camera. I'll put a link in the description. And what I'd like you to do is take 3 shots. One with the widest aperture that your camera will go to, so that's the lowest f number. If that will probably be something like f4, f5.6. If you've got a really nice lens, it might be f2.8 or 1.4. But go to that smallest number you can find. Then repeat the process with a mid-range aperture, and for that I would choose f8. And then finally do the same again with the smallest aperture you've got. Remember, that's the highest f number, f22, 32, whatever it happens to be, the highest number you can find on your camera. Now as you're taking those photos, have a look what's going on in your viewfinder or on the display on the back of your camera, and see what shutter speed that the camera is selecting. And then review your photos after you've taken them and look at the foreground, the middle ground and the background and see which bits are in focus, so you're getting an idea of what depth of field you get with each of those different f numbers. When you've done that, let's repeat the exercise in shutter priority and start with your first shot at a 60th, then move up to a faster one like 1/250th, and finally choose a really fast one, whatever your camera might go to, a 2000th. And do the same observations, you know, look at what effect that's had on the foreground, middle ground and background, and look at the aperture that your camera selected to go with those shutter speeds. Now don't worry if all that didn't fall into place first time. In my next video I'm going to do a walk around and do some of those practical tests with you, and I'm going to show you how selecting different apertures and different shutter speeds can affect the creative look at your photo. Once you've got your head around this whole aperture and shutter influence on your photo, then you're going to be starting to think about what creative or artistic effect do I want in my photograph, and that's going to lead you to what you're going to select: aperture priority or shutter priority. What aperture or shutter speed am I going to need? If you have any questions want to share your photos or get some feedback, you can join the Nifty 50 Photographers Facebook group. That takes a bit of saying. And post your photos with your questions and I'll do my best to answer them. I'll put a link in the description to the Facebook group. So I did say if you stay to the end, I've got a great tip for you. Just before I do that, if you have enjoyed this video, please tell your friends. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and ring that bell too so that you get notified for the next video. So my top tip for keeping your camera steady is to make use of your strap. So how do we do that? So what you want to do is have your strap probably round your neck, and you're going to keep your camera pulled out. So if you pull it tight round your neck, you've already got some sort of stabilization effect, and that will allow you to get away with slower shutter speeds because it's harder for your camera to shake. One other thing you could do, and we'll talk about how to do this in another setting, is set a little pre-timer on your camera so that there's a 2-second delay before the photo takes. Because when you go through that motion of pressing on the shutter, that can make the camera shake up and down. So if you press the shutter, there's then a 2-second delay before the camera fires off, then that's helped to eliminate that little bit of shake that you would get by pressing the button. And that's a great technique for taking pictures at slow shutter speeds when you haven't got any other way of stabilizing yourself. And we'll show you that in practice in my next video. Make sure you come back and join me then.